Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode's that new film known as Crimes of the Future. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, sitting here very comfortably in my Sith Lord Snuggie, that has the sleeves that are just far too long and flop on my fingers when I, especially being Italian, I just use my hands a lot, so they just flapping all over the place. Sorry if you hear that on the audio, everybody.
Oh man, hi, I'm Bryan. I'm here in my comfy bone chair that I just updated the OS on this thing, so I should be good for the rest of this recording. If you hear it kind of jostling around, just it's making me comfortable.
They need to replace D-box seats with those things. I'm tired of having shit sprayed in my face. I just want a bone chair.
That'd be cool.
That rocking me around.
Yeah. While you're eating your popcorn to make sure that it's going down easily or whatever.
I mean, as you do when you watch a David Cronenberg film. The main thing I like to do is have a very gourmet meal prepared before I watch fucked up shit happening to bodies. But welcome everybody to the N for New episode for our Hard Sci-Fi season, in the middle of our Hard Sci-Fi hot summer. We're in the middle of that. We're bouncing the ball around while also quantifying exactly how the beach ball is able to move up, and occasionally it floats up on its own, and we're very curious about that. But I'm sure everything will be fine. But a lot of our picks, as will particularly come clear, with our last episode, a 2019 film, and then our next couple, which are from the 2000s, our picks are kind of skewing more toward the recent, I would say, overall this season. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when we had the N for New, we kind of had the trouble of, it seems post-2020, there's been a bit more of a dearth in sort of the hard sci-fi angle of things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and of course, part of that is, the pandemic and stuff like that, which made it hard to make any movies, of course, but in particular, of course, made it hard to make, any kind of science fiction where you need, elaborate sets and elaborate, visual effects and stuff like that. So, yeah, there hasn't been that many, although there have been some great sci-fi movies already this decade, but yeah, we had a bit of trouble kind of finding one that fit into this, hard sci-fi category, but yeah, we've picked one that I think is a good pick, even if it is not the most sci-fi. I would say that the hard sci-fi is kind of baked into this movie. It is not a hard sci-fi movie per se. I don't know. I still think this is a very good pick, and I'm very excited to talk about this movie because I love this movie a lot.
The ones we kind of contemplated, which might include, say, the movie I'm going to talk about later on between the lines, put a pin in that, right, tend to be ones that, did skew sort of, especially sci-fi and horror elements, mm-hmm, I would say. I think this one definitely does, obviously, given the director and everything. But at the same time, this one feels at least, grounded enough to where, the horror elements are more, aesthetic, I would argue.
Yeah.
And the sci-fi is, I guess, more, upsetting and depressing, which I think is part of another reason why, even after, COVID protocols went down for, productions, you still don't get a lot of hard sci-fi, because it feels like the more cerebral we get in sci-fi, it almost feels like the more, we venture toward uncomfortable subject matter that maybe isn't as commercial necessarily.
Yeah, right.
And especially in a post people giving a shit about COVID world, which is really what it is. Not post-COVID, sure, but post everyone caring necessarily. People who about immunocompromised and all this other shit. It feels that they that Hollywood definitely has skewed away from hard sci-fi. Most of the sci-fi movies we've gotten as of recent have been more fantastical. been much more in the realm of like big sort of like space fantasy, which we've talked about previously, kind of more in the Star Wars vein.
Right.
And I don't know, I still think there's a place for sort of that hard sci-fi, especially as we encroach into the 2020s and certain things kind of come up. I guess there's a delicate balance of like, do we want to address more uncomfortable hard sci-fi elements that come from, living in the 2020s necessarily?
Yeah, and I think another part of it is that, as we go into the 2020s, and I think technology becomes scarier, our phones but just AI surveillance, like previously in movies, it would feel a bit fantastical to show that kind of stuff, right? Like the Minority Report future, or like the Enemy of the State, right? Like those kind of like conspiracy thrillers about like surveillance.
Right.
Whereas now I think that is a lot more prevalent in our everyday society, and we've kind of, in some ways, accepted it. And I think it can be difficult for movies to kind of show that in a more, it's no longer fiction, essentially, in some ways. And I think this movie, though, has a lot of elements that feel very modern, and it feels like this movie is addressing a lot of things that we are kind of discussing in society, and it feels like it is something that is, looking to the future of like where we're going as a species, basically, and stuff like that.
Though noticeably with this movie, there's also the interesting factor of like a lot of newer technology is not present. Like
Right.
in this movie, there aren't really cell phones or iPads or anything like that, which was a deliberate choice for Cronenberg, just in terms of like the society he's currently depicting in this movie. Feels like it's kind of like, oh, we've moved kind of past that in terms of that being accessible to everybody, because shit's gotten like kind of bleak, and people are accepting of it. I think in the way that you're talking about, I think the closest we've gotten to something like that is if it's in a more playful tone. Like I would say Weirdly, even though the skews way more into horror and even comedy and satire, but something like Megan or Mothregan,
Sure.
as I would appropriately call it, based on the promotional materials. But that's a movie that like deals with sort of like, oh, this is like the modern future where like kids are addicted to iPads and all this other stuff, but we're kind of just addressing it as more of like a broad satirical idea as opposed to like really engaging with what that means.
Or you have a movie very similar to Megan, of course, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, which also feels like it's really reckoning with AI as a concept in society and what it means.
Dead reckoning, one could say,
Dead
with
reckoning,
all these things.
yes. And, right, yeah. And so it is kind of interesting how we are choosing to address these topics, especially as we kind of move into the 2020s and we become, I think, a lot more aware of the impact that like technology and these things are having on us. Something that, the director of this movie has kind of, in some weird way, almost prophesized over the past few decades with his movies, which we'll get into, of course. But yeah, it's interesting to think about, and I'm curious what other kind of sci-fi movies we will have, especially about AI and other things like that.
Especially when, like, you mentioned Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, or I guess now it's not Part 1. It's just Dead Reckoning, and we're going to have a different title for the 8th one.
Yeah, I don't know. Who knows at this point?
Whatever. Even that version of, like, the entity that we see is, like, a very fantastical version of what we're dealing with in modern AI, where that feels much more in the traditional vein of, like, oh, it's a super intelligent force that's accumulating all of this and has its own kind of sentience, as opposed to, like, generative AI, as we know, it really isn't going to have that kind of, like, almost Terminator-style problem.
Sure.
As much as just, like, expounding a lot of resources and people's creative output just to make shitty art.
Yes.
And shitty versions of things that already exist anyway. But because something created that was a machine and did it very quickly, that means it's good, according to tech bros. So, what do we know?
Especially that movie, which has this real urgency of like, this will change everything, and like nothing will be the same after this. It really kind of nails that kind of inevitability of like, yeah, for now it is like someone made like a shitty Wes Anderson parody with like AI or whatever, but that is kind of, I think, where that is headed, of just AI in general, and it's kind of scary, especially like the way that movie sort of depicts it. It really just made me kind of think how kind of terrifying it is to live in the society that we live in, and a kind of fear of the future that I think this movie also has, which I really love and I'm really fascinated by. And I think it's kind of where we can take science fiction and like, I'm curious just where we'll take things, especially with Crimes of the Future being a movie that is at the beginning of the decade, and it feels like it has a lot of ideas that we'll get into and stuff.
Well, that's as good a time as any, I think, to get into our film. Let's talk about Crimes of the Future.
We've all felt that the body was empty. Empty of meaning. And we've wanted to confirm that, so that we could fill it with meaning.
The world is a much more dangerous place now that pain has all but disappeared.
Surgery is sex, isn't it?
Is it?
You know it is. Surgery is the new sex. Let us not be afraid to map the chaos inside. Let us create a map that will guide us into the heart of darkness.
So Crimes of the Future came out June 3rd, 2022 in theaters from director-writer David Cronenberg. This is his most recent feature film, even though he does have an upcoming movie that premiered at Cannes recently. The Shrouds, I believe is what it's called.
Correct, yeah. With Vincent Cassel and Diane Kruger.
Yes, Vincent Cassel essentially playing David Cronenberg based on the images. He just looks exactly like stylized like David Cronenberg, 100% like the same hair and outfit and everything. But yes, this is his most recent, widely released at least film, Crimes of the Future. And there's, a lot of background with Cronenberg in that he's been making movies since, the 70s. Most people would know him as more of the body horror guy, which he was much more famous for sort of in that 70s through the late 80s period. And then kind of started transitioning into doing just weird fucked up dramas through the 90s and the 2000s. But this is kind of returned to form in terms of the body horror angle of it. And I'm curious, what is your journey with David Cronenberg in general?
I don't think I had seen any of his movies up until a couple years ago, right before this movie came out, Crimes of the Future. And I went through and I watched all of his movies. And I mean all of them. Like, I fucking watched Fast Company, which is a very bad movie, I think.
Even I haven't seen Fast Company. That's
not great.
dedication.
It's not great. But he's one of those directors, though, that kind of has a bit of a false start, right? Like, his first few movies, like Shivers and Rabid, are very interesting because they kind of have a lot of that body horror elements and feel like a calling card for what he wants to do. But then he makes like Fast Company, which is a movie about cars and like racing, and it doesn't work all the way. And then he makes The Brood, which is a great movie, super chill. Definitely doesn't feel like a guy who definitely just got divorced made it.
No, that guy seems to be from a guy who's in a healthy state of mind about marriage and being with another person, especially women. Really has great thoughts about women at that point.
Yeah, but I really, really love David Cronenberg. I think yes, most people kind of put the body horror thing of him, which is of course from like Videodrome and Scanners and The Fly, which are all great movies. I love all of those, but I think the thing that distinguishes Cronenberg is he's a very cold filmmaker. Like, a lot of his movies, like The Dead Zone or even like Dead Ringers, just have this like steely coldness to them. And just the way that he's always depicted, like, of course he's from Toronto, he's shot a lot of his movies there, and he always depicts Toronto as just this like dead, like just lifeless city almost. Especially in like Dead Ringers or in Crash.
And even when the one time he was out of Toronto was in like Maps to the Stars, which is one of the most cynical Hollywood movies ever made.
Definitely.
And that's saying something.
Right, absolutely. Or it's something like Cosmopolis, which also has that sort of like, is everything ending? Is the world ending? Is this like the end of society, basically? And all of his movies have that sort of just oppressive quality to them, and just really feel kind of apocalyptic almost in just his depiction of cities and people and all this stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I love him. I think he's one of my favorite filmmakers, maybe. Yeah, what about you? I don't know. What's your kind of journey with Cronenberg?
At a young age, my dad showed me a lot of the sort of 80s movies, particularly The Fly. The Fly was definitely the first one of his I saw. One of many examples of my dad being like, the effects are really cool in this, so you, like, 10-year-old Toms can totally watch this. Except I'm going to cover your eyes a bit when Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum are in bed together.
Right, that's the gross part of that movie.
Right, that's the part that child can't see. Because it's like, oh no, Jeff Goldblum has like a couple like weird things coming out of his back. That's upsetting. They're in bed together and they don't have shirts on. As opposed to, you know, everything else about that movie that's very chill, very normal, and not at all disgusting. But I mean, like that and The Dead Zone I remember watching when I was younger. With Cronenberg, it's fascinating because, like, obviously, like you mentioned, there is the kind of like the body horror thing is what he's most well known for, deservedly. I mean, especially if you watch, like, you know, those movies are Scanners, obviously, with the like head explosion and shit like that. The guy was kind of a master of a specific kind of like body-related gore. At least hit a bit more of the mainstream than like your more gore-houndy kind of like niche horror, I would say. Sure. Especially like The Fly being like the magnum opus example of that. That was somehow... It's so funny that that's his like most mainstream movie. Really,
right?
When you think about it, especially when you consider it's like it's basically a movie that has the plot that could be done like in a black box theater.
Yes, right.
Because it's like 3 characters, 2 different locations, not a lot. Like it could just be done as a play. Despite like all of that gore and all of that stuff, like you mentioned, that silliness is what's been very central. Even as he gets out of that horror period and goes into more of like the fucked up dramas, there is still that kind of like that silliness, that coldness. And when warmth does come through, it's mostly like tragedy. Like in The Dead Zone or Dead Ringers. Those are movies where like the main emotion that comes out of it is like, oh yeah, this is a sad situation and everyone here is like losing.
Right.
In this particular scenario.
Or it's something like Crash, which is maybe my favorite movie of his, I will say. I've only seen it once though, for reasons that are obvious if you've seen the movie Crash.
Too sexy for you. You were too turned on by that.
Those cars, man. Auga,
That's your new car horn knock too.
The finale of that movie is sort of gentle, kind of tender moment that, of course, is underpinned by this like deeply, deeply upsetting like setup and the context surrounding it and everything. And even, you know, as he's making Crash, he also makes a movie like Naked Lunch, where, you know, your typewriter comes to life and like talks to you, because that's a normal thing for a David Cronenberg movie. You know, like that movie also just has a lot of that more like, you know, weirdly his movies also have a lot of visual effects to them, right? Like not just The Fly, of course, which is like maybe one of the best showcases for just like 80s practical effects ever, I would say. But like Naked Lunch has so much of those like gross creatures, and they're all like analog, and it just feels, you know, he makes gross movies, but I think he does a really great job of having a tactility to that ickiness that really helps. And even in a movie like Crimes of the Future, but it also just helps when he goes into more of his dramas in the 2000s, like History of Violence or Eastern Promises. Like he really kind of nails a lot of that, like we talked about last week with Claire Denis, that kind of like fleshy quality to it, you know, to his movies. Potentially,
I guess, a hot take in terms of certain film circles. Once we get into like the new millennium, I'm a bit more hot and cold on Cronenberg, I would say.
Mm-hmm, sure.
I feel like particularly when you get to stuff like A Dangerous Method or Cosmopolis, personally, I feel very like underwhelmed by those. Nothing else, because like that silliness is still there, but it feels more akin to like if you watch any of his earlier sort of experimental movies from college, where it's a lot of people just kind of like wandering around. Particularly, we should mention, there is a earlier film that Cronenberg did around his college days in 1970 called Crimes of the Future, which I did watch because it's on Criterion currently. I will save you all the trouble. The 63 minutes you could spend watching that, I would not recommend, because it has little to nothing to do with anything that's in here. Like, he just kind of took that basic title. That movie is, as far as I could determine, based on the limited plot and also my limited interest in it, it's basically about, like, this group of dermatologists in a weird future where, like, cosmetics has caused a weird virus to break out that specifically attacks, like, adult women. So we're mostly just stuck with, like, a bunch of dudes who are walking around this dermatologist research facility, aka David Cronenberg's college. It's a lot of, like, a bunch of, like, young guys wandering around a college campus in Toronto, basically. They couldn't record sound because of the cameras, so it's a lot of narration over it, kind of talking about, like, oh yes, we have been studying things about, like, feet. There's a lot of foot fetishism in there, and also it ends up getting into, like, a weird gang of, like, pedophiles as well, which is kind of concerning, but also not interesting, which is a weird place to be in. The only thing it really comes about is there's a point where they talk about the idea of creative cancer from, like, basically, you know, somebody, like, harvesting organs and fearing that they will be stolen, so they steal them themselves, which I think is the closest connective thread that this has to the 2022 Crimes of the Future. But otherwise, not really much of anything interesting. That and Stereo, his other kind of, like, experimental film from the 60s, are only really for completionists.
Yeah, I have seen Stereo, and it sounds like what you just described for Crimes of the Future, where it is,
Right.
granted, a gorgeous campus. Like, you know, I don't know which campus it is in Toronto, but it's, like, a gorgeous, like, campus. But it is mostly people in, like, these rooms, and it's all narration, and you can see a lot of the ideas that he's maybe going for, but I would also say that, like, if you want a kind of better version of that, watch Shivers or Rabid, because those still have a lot of those kind of weirder, kind of weird, wildly ambitious kind of ideas, but feel they're more manageable because they are just more straight up horror, right? Like, it's just a more of a straightforward horror movie. Do you think he's interesting, though, from that perspective of he made his experimental movies and his first few movies, and, you know, we cover a lot of directors who, like, their first movie was, like, a huge thing. We did, like, a top 10 directorial debuts list, like, last year.
Patreon.com/cinema2letter.
Very, very good, Thomas. Your check's in the mail. But it's just interesting to get someone like this who kind of didn't get started making really great movies for a while. So, yeah, it's just kind of interesting, his kind of career, and especially, I think, post Cosmopolis and Maps to the Stars, he doesn't really make anything until Crimes of the Future for 8 years.
Right.
Which, of course, there's a lot of reasons for that, but which is apparent watching this movie. You can kind of assume that he had a hard time getting funding and just getting something off the ground because Hollywood kind of stopped really making, you know, a lot of movies, but especially just the movie that he makes, and just how kind of wild and weird his past couple movies were. It was just kind of a shame to see him unable to make something.
Right, especially as you kind of get to, like, that 2010s period leading up to Maps of the Stars. It feels like kind of the budgets are dwindling.
Yes.
And it feels like he's kind of, like, stuck with, you know, like, say, A Dangerous Method is really 3 actors on, like, in, like, one house, basically. It's like Viggo and Michael Fassbender and Keira Knightley just kind of, like, talking in rooms together. And then Maps of the Stars kind of feels like him letting out all his frustrations in a really fascinating way.
Yeah.
Of just kind of, like, saying fuck you to Hollywood on several levels, and making one of the least sort of commercial movies I think you can make, possibly, and also that would at the same time also alienates Hollywood on a more direct level.
Yeah.
And more importantly, I think also has the most disgusting thing in a David Cronenberg movie, which is Mia Wasikowska kissing a star on the Walk of Fame.
Oh, yeah.
As someone who's been to Hollywood and been, like, on Hollywood Boulevard, that is literally the dirtiest street in America. I would be genuinely concerned for her safety. I just, like, you're going to die in moments, Mia. You can't kiss a star on the Walk of Fame. People pee all over this place.
I like the idea of Cronenberg being like, finally, Maps to the Stars, I'm letting all my frustrations, and I'm doing my sickest trick yet. And it's that.
I believe Pattinson vomited off camera for that. I'm sure he just, like,
I'm sure he
God,
did.
David.
I'm sure he did, that weirdo. But Maps to the Stars also, I think, alienates a lot of, like, the people who love David Cronenberg for his more, like, even, like, stuff like Eastern Promises and A History of Violence, although they are very much divorced from the body horror thing. Like, you have in Eastern Promises the sauna scene, which feels
God,
very,
yes.
very like, yes, this is kind of what, feels like the next step for what he's trying to do of like...
Easily my favorite, I would say, of like the 21st century period Cronenberg, I would say.
I would agree, but I think Crimes of the Future might take it for me, but a lot of people, I think, when they saw Maps to the Stars 2, were just like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is not what we want from you, David Cronenberg, and kind of similar to Cosmopolis, even though both of those movies also feature Robert Pattinson post his whole Twilight thing. It was him breaking out of that, which we'll talk about something related to that, I guess, in a little bit.
That's true, because we just talked about High Life last week.
Right.
And we're talking about another Twilight star.
Yes.
Here in a moment. But we should note that, like, during this period, he did try and make a sort of version of Crimes of the Future. In 2003, he attempted to make a movie called Painkillers, which explored a lot of these things like performance art and society, where pain is now, like, not really that common, and there's surgery and self-mutilation. So a lot of these themes were apparently going to be in there. And this would have been a version that would have starred apparently Ralph Fiennes as the Saul character. Which would have been interesting, even though not his first choice, because he went to Nicolas Cage first and he dropped out.
I can see Nick Cage with that black robe over him, just doing some weird shit. Oh man,
We're doing weird gagging and shit. Yeah, that is much Ralph Fiennes though. Ralph Fiennes feels very odd. I think of like the three people who potentially were that role, including Vigo.
Yeah, not that Ralph Fiennes can't be like a bit of a freak, but obviously he's worked a lot with Vigo. And I believe the term, as the kids say these days, is they match each other's freak, weirdly enough, because there's so many interviews where it's them like flirting. There's like the pictures of them just like kissing on like the red carpet and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about Vigo, I think, as we get into the movie. But yeah, I mean, I'm a huge David Cronenberg fan, I guess, just overall, and I am really happy that he is kind of back being able to make movies, right? Like, I think he has really, with Crimes of the Future and The Shrouds, I think he's back officially, and he also just seems to be really aware and accepting of kind of his own mortality and how old he is and how much he's aging. And there's all those interviews of him where he's like, yeah, I'm dying, I don't fucking care, like, like I've accepted it. And I don't know.
Well, and especially when the stuff about the Shrouds is very much connected to the passing of his wife.
Right.
As well. 'Cause it's about a guy who looks like David Cronenberg apparently dealing with the loss of his wife to cancer.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like interesting parallels there as well. I think that's what's going to be fascinating too, is like from just this movie and him kind of returning to body horror, it feels very much like we're even seeing a different angle. Because I was very curious about seeing this, obviously. I remember, we should note, this was one of the movies we saw together around the time that like we kind of like rekindled our friendship after the pandemic kind of dwindled that, amongst other things. And it was fascinating kind of going into this because I was like, okay, I'm very curious to see that Cronenberg kind of returned to body horror. And this definitely has shades of the earlier body horror stuff, but there's even more of a sort of clinicalness.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, and even less of kind of like, there's like fucked up weird people in it, as you know, if you're all ears, you might know some of the like weird fucked up things that feel more reminiscent of his earlier movies. But this one feels more like, we're getting a guy who's at a stage in his life where things are starting to, it feels like he's dealing with like, I am starting to decay along with everyone else. Like he's kind of dealt with that throughout his career of like, I am decaying, we are all decaying the moment we're born.
Right.
We're starting to like, we evolve and therefore decay to some degree, but he feels kind of like this is where like instead of mutating into weird pustules, because that's my favorite thing about Cronenberg's earlier work is like the body horror stuff, like Videodrome is a great example of this, is it's about basically like a guy who as a kid probably looked at like a weird cut or bruise that he had and he's like, wow, that looks weird, I want to poke it. I keep like poking it and see how that's going. And I feel like now he's less in that kind of curiosity stage and more just an acceptance of like, yeah, parts are like falling off me, whatever. I'm not going to look at and poke at that decaying flesh. I'm just kind of like throw it out and go about my day kind of thing.
Well, yeah. And it also feels like this Crimes of the Future definitely feels like a late career movie, where someone is a bit more reserved, a bit more restrained. And it also, I think, early on, I think Cronenberg has always had that fascination of like, right, these questions of body horror, of our bodies changing, of, just all those ideas. And he is kind of fascinated by them. But this feels like a movie where he is presenting those ideas to us and is kind of like really horrified by that idea. I think he's always kind of horrified by that idea, but in this movie you just feel it a lot more because he is older and he is like, as he has himself has said, like he is dying and all of this stuff. There's just a real palpable sense of his own mortality, as opposed to like his earlier movies, which are great as well, but you know what I mean, I think.
Right. We should mention like that earlier production from like around 2003 that fell apart, and so I believe after this is around the time that he pivots over to like History of Violence.
Right.
And goes more down that path. But yeah, so that ends up like kind of falling apart, and then just out of the blue, I believe it was Vigo said in an interview in like 2021, just like, yeah, you know, I'm doing something with Cronenberg. He's finally like directing again, and we were all just kind of like, well, sure, fine. I don't know. It's been a while. Right. I don't know if that's actually true. And then this movie just kind of quickly came together, which is part of like our excitement for it when it eventually came out. And then yeah, it ends up being, you know, this very fascinating exploration of like sort of the hard sci-fi element, which, you know, if somehow you're listening to this and you haven't seen Crimes of the Future, which is possible given this wasn't very successful when it came out, basically this follows, you know, in the not too distant future, mainly this performance artist Saul Tenser, played by Viggo Mortensen, and his accomplice Caprice, played by Léa Seydoux, who were performance artists that mainly specialize in weird surgery that's done as performance art, where like they have this whole bed that has like little armatures that feel very existency.
Yes.
In terms of the like bone kind of look to them, where he is like cut open and like certain body parts that he grows, because that's a big thing. It's like this is dealing with kind of like in this near future, like the human body, at least in terms of like him and certain like few other people who we kind of meet later, people are starting to like produce new organs. And, you know, Vigo kind of takes this more of like a weird performance artist kick, which he does, you know, in between bouts of sitting in a bed that he's connected to that somehow keeps him like alive, because he's constantly like hunched over and coughing and just in a state of like intense pain, which is very uncommon for like most people in this future cannot feel pain.
Right.
Because like humanity has evolved to a certain point where it's like, yeah, we don't really feel pain anymore. That's not kind of a thing. So everyone feels very cold and detached, like Cronenberg characters. And even Vigo is a bit detached, but also he's kind of like, the most excitement he gets is like, oh, I'm feeling a new pain in my lower abdomen. It's kind of fucking hot, I think, but also I don't really do the new sex anymore. Like, I think the one organ that's not doing much is in between his legs, if you catch my drift. He says it at one point, hey, I'm bad at the old sex.
He does, yeah.
As opposed to the new sex, which is surgery. And there's, you know, all this stuff where, like, they encounter various different people, including this bureau that mainly that deals with kind of like the organization of organs, called the National Organ Registry, which is run by Whippet, played by Dominic McKellar, and also Timlin, played by Kristen Stewart, as a performance that I would describe as a mouse who just turned into a human.
Yeah, yeah. I think when I saw this, I think I described her as a horny mouse, and
right.
I think I've seen this movie, I think 3 times now. I think it is one of the best supporting performances of the decade. I'm kind of calling that.
I mean, she's pretty great, but
yeah.
Just to briefly like kind of wrap up,
Sure.
We'll get into Stewart in a moment, but just. So while this is going on with like he has to report to this National Organ Registry and have his organs tattooed and stuff like that, and encounter like other performance artists who are kind of doing some of this stuff. He also is seemingly a informant for a Detective Cope, played by Welket Burgeau, who he keeps feeding information about this weird resistance group that's kind of coming up, as led by Lang, played by Scott Speedman. He basically is leading this resistance group that is much more focused on like keeping that kind of evolution very central, because basically he, at the beginning of the movie, there's like this kid who ends up dying, who ends up being Lang's son, and as things are revealed, it turns out like, oh, this kid was like the next step in human evolution, in terms of like the organs that he was developing were not sort of like useless sort of like, appendices,
right,
that you could like function without,
yeah,
like Vigo has.
They created a system, a whole digestive system to eat plastic, or to digest plastic, which is a whole other thing, which we'll get into that angle of this movie.
That's a big thing. In case that plot synopsis wasn't very clear, this is a movie that's dealing with a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
It's really compounding like all of these like scientific ideas, and most of it is like told to you. There's like obviously some great like visual flourishes, but it's a lot of like characters talking back and forth about that kind of stuff, which I think in some movies can feel, like, oh, the classic like show don't tell
Right.
kind of angle of it, where it's like, I think this movie mostly avoids that. I think there's one subplot that I have some issue with that in, but otherwise I just find like that kind of back and forth discussion with particularly like our main characters a lot more fascinating because of the performances of these people, but also just kind of like it feels like it's much more about like, oh, how all these things are kind of like dealing with not just our main characters, but the macro angle of like, what does this mean for like this future where based on like the set design and stuff, we see the opening of this movie is a child playing on a beach where there's a giant cruise ship crashed
Right.
off to the side. We're dealing with the decay of society and just more of like we're casually living through it. It's not like, a post-apocalyptic movie in the way of like The Road. It feels like this is kind of like the middle point between the first Mad Max and Road Warrior.
Right, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Right.
I also, a thing I like about this movie, which also probably has something to do with the financial angle for Cronenberg, was this is mostly shot in Greece, in Athens. And
Yes.
the whole movie has this very decayed look to it that I think it's a lot easier to get in like Europe, and it has this just very industrial, run-down look to it, where because it's the National Organ Registry, so you presume that it's America because most people are speaking English and whatever, but we don't really know, and so it does kind of, you can imply that it's America. It is this like decayed America, but it's a great kind of it's a great thing of I'm sure he shot in Greece because it was just cheaper, and they probably helped him finance the movie and stuff like that, but it inadvertently kind of helps the movie have that kind of feel to it.
I can't believe you were so confused about this being all-American when we have all-American Lea Seydoux.
Right.
The most American actor possible to play one of the central parts in this film.
Yeah, well, I guess it is just Vigo, Scott Speedman, and a few of the other people we see are American, but yeah, it is kind of ambiguous as to where this takes place, which I kind of love, because we don't get a view of like, we hear a lot about like the things that the government is doing, of like the government puts into place the National Organ Registry because it's part of the new Vice unit, which is this kind of, I guess, department handling like new Vice, which it would be like organs and surgery and this new kind of thing that has cropped up.
Pivoting away from Miami with the Vices.
Right, yeah, of course. It'd be great if they got Crockett and Tubbs in this movie. But yeah, just a lot of those ideas of like what the government is trying to do to sort of quell this, and we never really, we zoom out in terms of like this movie's discussing a lot of kind of bigger topics, but we never zoom out and see like what the government looks like, or what, like, this movie has a lot of bureaucracy, but it doesn't really get in the nitty-gritty of the bureaucracy and stuff like that, which I think helps with the kind of ambiguity of this movie, which I really love, for just to be clear.
This is the first time I'd watched it since we saw it together in theaters. Like, really what I interpreted it as is it feels kind of like these systems are in place, but because everything's crumbling, there's not really a lot of like, actual observation. I think the most we kind of get in terms of like any kind of organization is weirdly from the one company that's kind of it's like a lifeware firm, I believe is what it's called.
Yeah,
right?
something like that, right? Yeah,
right. That's the most organization we get, in that we have like these two characters who pop up here and there who are technicians. It's Burst, played by Tanya Beatty, and Router, played by Nadia Litz. They feel like the most kind of like, oh, they actually have like a job and there's like a more specific mission
right
involved, given like what's revealed about those two characters. But otherwise, everyone else kind of feels like they're kind of wandering. Like even Scott Speedman, who ostensibly is, like I mentioned, leading this like weird rebellion and has like a warehouse full of people in this like shanty town fucking like building that his offices are in. Like the most awful, rusted, pathetic looking place possible. At the same time, we see a lot of him just kind of like wandering around this weird city, and it feels almost like we kind of mentioned like what's the setting and nationality and all this other stuff. It feels almost like that doesn't even fucking matter anymore because everything's crumbling so much.
Yeah.
There isn't even like an America where there's just like a government and people who kind of like wander around these empty, vacant streets.
I mean, yeah, well, like, and what we get of like people in the streets whenever like Vigo and Lea Seydoux are like walking to wherever that building is that they do their art, we just see people like in the streets kind of like hugging each other, and it looks like they're like making out, but they're like cutting into each other because there's no pain anymore. And so this is kind of this weird new thing of like how you feel something, I guess. And the setting is like, yeah, just anywhere, right? It is just like society in general. And it really just kind of creates this feeling that this movie feels like a movie from the end of the world, right? Like it has that feeling of like it truly, it is one of the only movies I think to really capture the feeling that I think I and a lot of people have had over the past few years of like, so this is all like falling apart, right? Like this is, it really has a palpable feeling, and it just feels like that the entire time, this kind of oppressive feeling, which I love. I love about this movie, and I love that there is no like you mentioned earlier, a lot of like the tech and stuff. There's no like computers, really. Like we'd never get any computers or iPhones or anything like that. And yeah, it just kind of adds to this kind of decay. And I like that there is this kind of analog feel to everything, not just like his bed and weird chair and stuff like that, but like when they go to the performance art showings, people are like filming things with like actual like cameras. Like one of them has like one of those like old kind of like Super 8 kind of style cameras.
Well, it's either that or the most advanced tech, which is like the Ring cameras.
Right. Not for your doorbell.
No, not those. Good point. Yes, to clarify, just a literal ring on your finger that has a camera in it,
which is so cool. I think it's the one part of this movie where, besides all the weird Cronenberg bone chair and stuff like that, that is the kind of one sci-fi element that is like, oh, that's really cool and really kind of inventive and feels like, an easy way to just like, how does she film this stuff? Like, just put a ring. And like, I love the part where she opens and she has a bunch of them that are presumably just like different kinds of cameras or whatever. It's very cool.
Which also results in one of my favorite Stewart deliveries, where Lea Seydoux is filming initially like them tattooing the organs in Viggo Mortensen. It's Kristen Stewart just says like, you can't do that. That's not legal. It's like, oh, but I just figured we'd use it for art. It's illegal. Like she just starts swelling. It's illegal.
She feels like her performance in this feels like someone who is trying not to go above a whisper, but is just like in that ground of like just above a whisper, but just below like, your voice getting too kind of high. It's such a specific performance. Like it's so great.
Well, I mean, let's talk about our cast a bit more. We can start with Stewart, obviously. Kind of like we mentioned, we covered Robert Pattinson last time, so his Twilight co-star, Kristen Stewart, is here, and this is definitely part of, a more recent example of what she's been doing for the last, like, decade or so at this point. Post-Twilight, just doing these incredibly fascinating movies. And I think the big difference between her and Pattinson, even though they, travel in similar waters, Pattinson is much more of, like, any performance where it's like, I want to be a fucking freak.
Yeah, he's a freaky guy.
Right, and that's something that Stewart isn't against. Like, in this movie, I would argue she's playing a fucking freak. Yeah. A weirdo. But she really, I think, has an even more broad palette in terms of what she's able to explore. Even, like, the varieties of freak are so fascinating, where, like, the freak she's playing in Crimes of the Future is miles different from, like, the freak in Love Lies Bleeding.
Right.
Both freaks, just incredibly diverse range of freaks.
Yes. And then, as she's, able to play, like, freaky weirdos. I think they call her creepy twice in this movie, where I love that Lea Seydoux was like, don't you think she was a little, like, creepy? Which is just so funny. But she's also able to, I think, obviously go for a more kind of dramatic performance in, like, Spencer. I don't really like that movie that much. I think she should have won the Oscar, though, for Best Actress. I still maintain that. Sorry, Jessica Chastain? Did Jessica Chastain win for Tammy Faye?
Yeah, that's Jessica Chastain, right? That's the Tammy Faye thing, yeah. Movie everyone still loves and talks about, as they did at the time.
We're all talking about Tammy Faye. Or she's able to give, like, a performance like Certain Women, where it is like very quiet and very deliberate, and is still doing the Kristen Stewart thing where, you know, the thing I think about when I think of her performances and her as an actress is I'm always hanging on every word she's saying, because she has such a specific delivery of every line. And it isn't just the whole like, oh, she's awkward kind of thing, but it's more that she just has such control over like how, especially in this movie, like how high does she raise her voice? Like how quickly does she talk? Where she's kind of talking like this, and like all of these things, and she has such a great control over how she delivers a line. Where even in Love Lies Bleeding, there are certain moments where I'm, you know, just hanging on like the way she delivers a certain line, and I think that comes across in like in really all her movies, even something like fucking Charlie's Angels, which I think even she was like, yeah, that movie's awful, which I don't think it's that bad, but like even in that, I think she is kind of interesting, and yeah, she's just, I don't know, such a fascinating actress, and I'm always fascinated to see what she's going to do, and especially because, yeah, she makes really interesting choices where, you know, she will work with David Cronenberg, and she'll work with, you know, Olivier Assayas and Kelly Reichardt and Ang Lee,
and
right?
even as a young child actress, she was working with fucking David Fincher and shit.
Right, yeah, she's really great in Panic Room, I think.
Yes.
But yeah, I just think she's one of the most exciting actresses working today, and I'm just always curious to see something she's in, because I know that she's at least going to be interesting. Like, I have not thought about that movie Underwater, except for like her performance and also the reveal at the end, which I think is really cool. But yeah, she makes really interesting choices, and she is kind of quite unpretentious about her career, where she will do Underwater or Charlie's Angels or something like that, but then we'll also do Spencer and this and Love Lies Bleeding. So,
and even in like those Twilight movies, like people, you know, myself included, often would like at the time make the jokes about like, oh, she's a terrible actress, she's so awkward,
Right.
and it's like it's just people not really realizing that, especially when I revisited those movies, it's like, oh wait, no, this is a clear, deliberate performance of like a weird, awkward girl who wants to fuck a vampire man.
not dissimilar to this movie.
Not too dissimilar, no, that's true. Especially with the Vigo, who feels like the more Nosferatu-y than Dracula necessarily, in terms of his body type and everything else. But yeah, I think I definitely would say like the best kind of display for me of like Stewart and her like range is something like Personal Shopper.
Yeah.
Where she does have kind of like, there's a normalcy to that performance, but then as you sort of like go further and further into like there's this ghostly element and what that means and the haunting elements of it, you get a full range of her like almost going through the stages of grief throughout that whole movie, going through like this bargaining and regret and like acceptance and all this other stuff. I think that's probably my favorite use of her in anything. It's just like, it's such an incredible turn from her. But let's talk about some other people. There's just some other people in this cast.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Vigo. We kind of mentioned Vigo a bit. So Vigo obviously is fascinating because like you know him most, of course, like most people would from you know, the Lord of the Rings movies.
Yeah, did you know he was Aragorn?
Yeah, I know. I thought most people would know him from like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but I guess not.
Oh, I know him from,
You know.
as Tony Lip from Green Book.
Well, that's true. You know, the most authentic Italian performance that's ever happened.
Yeah, Thomas, every time we record, folds a pizza in half and bites into it.
That's always how I eat pizza. That's very true. But it is fascinating, especially when you consider like Vigo's 90s run is very weird. If you go back to stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 or the Psycho remake he's also in, there's also a great turn where he basically plays Satan in that movie, The Prophecy, with Christopher Walken, which is about like Christopher Walken plays like the angel Gabriel. He's going around fucking with people. And then Vigo shows up for like 3 scenes as Satan. And it's one of the more fascinating depictions, I would say, of Satan in a movie, just the way that he even plays it. He's so weird, and then, you know, he gets all this, like, mainstream acclaim for playing Aragorn. And he just takes that, kind of like that mainstream fame, and continues to do weird, fucked up shit, sometimes with Cronenberg, sometimes not. Even, like, it's so weird. Did you ever see that movie Captain Fantastic, the one he was nominated for?
I did. Not a bad movie, but very kind of twee indie, but he's good in it. I think
Right. But even that, it feels even more twee and bizarre than like even a Wes Anderson, which that movie is clearly trying to be. Like, this is a Wes Anderson movie. Right. And he just takes that. It's like, well, I'm not going to even have like the typical charm that people would get out of like Jason Schwartzman or Bill Murray in those movies. I'm just going to be like such an alienating fucking weirdo at the same time. Like, what do you think of, sort of the Vigo career?
I mean, yeah, I'm mostly familiar with him in The Lord of the Rings, which, of course, he is incredible in. Did you know that he broke his foot when he kicked that helmet?
I didn't. There's not a lot of information or documentary footage about those Lord of the Rings movies, really. I have that big box set that's just the 3 movies and no other discs at all.
But I love him in the Cronenberg movies. I think Eastern Promises is such an incredible performance from him.
Yes.
As well as something like The Road, which I haven't seen, in a while. But I remember really loving him in that movie. And yeah, it is weird. Like, I'm not as familiar with his career arc. I've seen him in... I don't remember him in Crimson Tide, but apparently he's in Crimson Tide. And we mentioned Green Book, but it is weird to think that that's the movie he made before this, even though there's a 4-year gap. But, he's not even bad in Green Book necessarily, but he is just like...
He is doing what he is asked.
Right.
What he's asked to do is just fucking insipid.
Right.
And dumb.
Right. What he's asked to do is just like be Italian, like just do the Italian thing, and he's very good. But also, you like watch him in interviews, especially kind of recently, as he's done like a lot of like visits to like TIFF and New York Film Festival and stuff like that, and he's very intelligent and smart and like very like well spoken, and also he loves David Cronenberg. Like, there's a great interview with them, I think when they were talking about Crash, I want to say. They just kept like doing a bit throughout the interview where it was like, you're coming over for dinner, right? And like implied like that they're gonna fuck, and they just kept doing that where they're like, well, Vigo, I'll see you at dinner tomorrow night. And I don't know, I love their relationship, right? Like I said earlier, like they match each other's freak, but like you really get a sense, especially in this movie, that like they are really comfortable with one another in terms of just their collaboration, and especially this performance, which I think is quite vulnerable, I think, in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways that he kind of hasn't done recently, right? Like, I'm sorry, but Green Book is not a vulnerable performance. And, even something like Captain Fantastic, which, again, he's pretty good in, but there's such a vulnerability to this performance that I just find really, really fascinating.
Well, especially considering like what he's playing here is like this weird performance artist who, like I mentioned, is like constantly in retching pain. Like,
right.
He spends most of his performance kind of like almost vomiting, pretty much.
Yeah.
Or that thing he does with his throat, which is like the most unsettling thing to me, where he's just like in his like chair, which we mentioned earlier, his weird bone armature chair that he uses to help him digest, and like rocks him around in a weird kind of D-boxy way, which is so funny to see him in that visual. But there are these points where he's trying to eat and it's like, oh, it's not working, my throat's closing up, and he'll just like grab his throat and like move it around,
right,
in a way where it's almost like, hold on, something's out of place, I gotta like crack this here and make it work. He's got like the body language here is definitely somebody who will not go to a chiropractor and just like cracks his knuckles and like his neck and just does that. It's like, no, I'm fine. It'll
so
work out.
Relatable.
100%. I say this from experience.
I mean, it's funny mentioning the kind of like the furniture in this movie, right? And kind of what it represents, I think, is so kind of interesting, because it is this weird thing of, well, pain doesn't exist anymore, so we have like designed this chair that will like perfectly turn your body so that your food will digest perfectly. And same with like the bed, right, where it like turns him at the right time. That's the one that I think feels very existence-y, with like the thing on his hand that like attaches to it. It reminds me of Existence when they like plug into the console.
The bed needs a new software update.
Right, but I think it's fascinating because it feels very silly and it feels very Cronenberg-y, especially when you look at what the bed looks like, and it's got all like the tentacles coming down and stuff, and it's like, Jesus, it's so David Cronenberg. It's almost like self-parody, but like all I could think about during that was just like those like super expensive beds where like you can turn like one side, it has like a warming function, like all these kind of like this idea of like technology making us like uber comfortable and just kind of tailoring these experiences super finely. And I don't know, it isn't out of the question, and like in my opinion, in like the future we have these weird beds that like turn us at the exact moment and stuff like that. They probably just won't have like tentacles that attach or anything, but
and they'll still sponsor podcasts, which Life Firmware, please sponsor us. We'll definitely. Are you tired of eating things and it just doesn't go down right? Get yourself a new body chair and use code C2L for 30% off. But yeah, I think you can really see sort of that vulnerability a lot in his interactions with Stewart.
yeah.
Like the sort of fascinating thing where as this movie progresses, like Viggo has less of his kind of like artist veneer that he's playing into a lot more. And there's that scene where like after he does like the big surgery sequence where like he's literally just getting off in front of people while Léa Seydoux cuts open his body with the weird fucking gooey gummy control panel thing. But like after that, when he's like lying on that chair, and he's still in like a weird diminutive position, obviously, because he's just kind of like, oh, I'm gonna like bask in here now that I've like done my show and I need to like rest my body. Kristen Stewart just like comes up to him and just says like, can I just talk to you with a very personal question? He's like, yeah, sure. Surgery, it's a new sex, right? I don't know if I ever thought that way.
But yeah, and I mean the way that Kristen Stewart kind of goes up to him, where she's like creeping to him, and like gets like right up on his ear to like whisper that to him, and you can tell he is kind of just like, what? And then he kind of thinks about it for a minute, and like Léa Seydoux's like, what was that? And he's like, just a new epiphany. And you can tell it like has affected him in some way.
Right, and the contrast is like later on when he ends up going back to the National Organ Registry and encounters Kristen Stewart again, where noticeably the visual indicator for her changes, she has the ponytail up.
Right.
And then by the end of the movie, it's all down. So she's been much more free and loose. And she starts like getting close to him and does that one of the most fascinating kisses I've seen in a movie recently. Yeah. Where she initially pauses to like give him a weird dental exam real quick and then makes out with him, which is fascinating and kind of hot, but also just weird.
Yeah.
On so many different levels. And then obviously that's where he just like kind of crumbles. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like his IBS accent. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm not good at the old sex. Sorry about that, Kristen Stewart. I can't fuck you.
That is one of my favorite scenes for Stewart's performance, I think, because it's like, it's so subtle in like how she kind of creeps to him like slowly as she sees him moving. But then there's that line that she gets where she's just talking about kind of the like new organs or whatever. She mouths like evolution, and she's like, I almost said it like out loud, and she like mouths it. And it's again, it's a thing I was talking about earlier where she has such control over like just her voice and how she's delivering that line. And it's just impossible not to just like keep your eyes on her. You just like have no idea what she's going to do next in this movie, and it's so fascinating.
And especially like in that sequence, it's so weird how, despite the fact that Viggo is clearly so much taller than her, he feels so much more like inadequate next to her. He just feels like he's kind of crumbling down to her level in a weird way, which is fascinating. Just the body language between those two is like, it's a great like playing off each other. And while we're talking about Viggo, I just want to bring up my big problem with the movie I kind of referenced earlier. Okay. My one sort of big issue that keeps me from saying this movie is like full-on masterpiece, and it involves Viggo and ties into the Kristen Stewart angle of it a bit. I really don't like most of the stuff with Viggo and the Detective Cope character. I think that is all the stuff that feels the most kind of like I mentioned earlier, the kind of like show don't tell element of it. Particularly, it almost feels like we're bringing up interesting ideas in those conversations back and forth, which noticeably mostly take place with Viggo in a completely different area. And it feels almost like Cronenberg maybe had more planned for like some of those things they're talking about. And just as a budget fix, it became like a conversation between two people instead of like really elaborating. Particularly like near the end of the movie, they have that conversation where he reveals like, oh yeah, our mole inside was Kristen Stewart. And she was the one who did all this stuff. And, like, that's the last we even hear about Kristen Stewart, or even, like, we don't see her after, like, the big final, like, autopsy scene that we get. And it feels just kind of like, once again, that stuff feels so much more like, okay, we're just kind of, like, almost fixing even, like, plot threads. We're tying up stuff in here that we couldn't really, like, do because we didn't have enough time with Stewart or something like that. It feels the most kind of, like, back and forth talking in a way that's not as engaging to me as a lot of the earlier stuff in the movie. And it's nothing on that actor, Bourgeau, who I think is solid. I think especially has that really fun bit where they're talking, and he references, like, oh, was Scott Speedman chewing up the bar, like, no, like, he makes weird gnawing noises, which is very fun. But that stuff feels the most kind of perfunctory to me, quite frankly. I don't know how you feel about that stuff.
I see what you mean. I disagree, though. I like those elements of the movie a lot, because it definitely feels like the part of the movie where it is explaining a lot more of the plot. But I think, again, with that conversation at the end where he's like, oh yeah, our mole was Kristen Stewart. And he's like, I don't know what happened to Scott Speedman at all, but whatever, maybe his wife got to him. It has this kind of ambiguity to it that I kind of like, and this kind of open-endedness that I really like. Like you said, like, I think the topics that are brought up in those conversations are really fascinating, and they kind of show a lot of the conflict with Viggo's character and kind of what he says he thinks versus, like, what we see him do, and all of this, the surgery and stuff like that. And I think that is enough for me to kind of just really like those scenes, and it works for me, I think, more as I see the movie, right? And I think the ending for me, their last conversation, kind of, when I first saw it, I struggled with a bit because of how open-ended it is, where it's like, oh, we're not gonna, like, address any, like, we're not gonna go into any of this stuff. But I don't know, it works for me, at least.
I think I would have less of, like, an issue with it if you didn't have something like I mentioned earlier, the characters Burst and Router, who I think have a lot of that ambiguity in that you're not quite sure, like, whose side are they on through, like, about most of the movie, like, what are they doing, are they, like, because they seem fascinated by the performance art stuff, but also it's clear, like, they're just, as things go along, they're like, oh, they want to make sure there are no loose ends to fuck up with the Life Firmware company, and how they're just, like, killing off all these people, like, very bluntly and frankly, and just kind of, like, moving about their time, which I think has a bit of that ambiguity, but also has a bit more of, like, action, and a lot more, like, of a fascinating thing to it, as opposed to, like, the some of the subjects that, like, Detective Cope is bringing up about, like, oh, we wanted to make sure, like, the government angle of it, and stuff like that, I think is much more interestingly handled with, like, the National Organ Registry stuff, where there is a weird ambiguity, like we mentioned, about, like, who are they reporting to? What is the function of the National Organ Registry beyond, like, keeping track of these organs? What's going on here? But at the same time, like, Stewart and Don McKellar's characters go through, like, weird, interesting arcs in the movie. Particularly, Don McKellar has such a, like, especially this time, I really glommed onto how, like, he's getting, like, so excited by this.
Yes.
Like, him and Kristen Stewart are, like, opening up in different ways, where Stewart's, like, becoming more sensually attracted, versus McKellar's just like, this is just neat. I just think it's neat, and I want to do, like, the inner beauty pageant and stuff.
I love that scene where he goes up to Lea Seydoux towards the end, and he's like, I have the fever. And he's like, yeah, I got it. Like, I'm really into it. It's like it's a new hobby for him. Like, it's a new, like, he's found a new interest. And
like a middle-aged man who discovered, like, oh, I can do wood shop stuff now.
Right,
this is
exactly,
fun.
Yeah.
I'm getting into World War II stuff now.
Right, it's like getting into, like...
I love History Channel.
It's like getting into Warhammer for him. He's, like, having a really great time with it.
I just love painting these little guys. Look at them. Like, these organs. I love putting little tattoos on them. To catch my Twitch streams where I do that.
But his stuff, and I think that the detective character stuff, I think also kind of, again, it's a bit subtextual in a way of the way... A topic that this movie is kind of getting at is the idea of the government wanting to, like, have control over these people's bodies.
Right.
And I think it's not something that I really kind of noticed when I was first watching the movie, because there's so much other stuff going on. But this time I really kind of tapped into that idea, and I think it's so fascinating because it's, I think, what Cronenberg is really interested in. And I think, a discussion that gets brought up a lot is the idea that, like, movies shouldn't tell you how to think, right? Like, a great movie doesn't tell you what it's about or how to think it or how to process it, right? It's and kind of like there's a great David Lynch quote, where he says like, you make a movie and people want you to talk about it, and the movie is the talking. And this movie, I think, raises a lot of questions and topics and issues, and it doesn't really tell you what to think, and it doesn't, give you an agenda necessarily. It is that thing about Cronenberg where he is fascinated by this idea and intrigued by it, and he is kind of equally horrified by it at the same time. And I think you really get that kind of conflict in the movie where, again, the government wanting to stop people from changing their bodies. I'm sure there are definitely real world parallels to that we're not kind of fit to talk about here, of course, but it's something that I think is...
Well, I mean, even, like, it was interesting. I watched, before we did this, like, one of those, it was Sadu and Mortensen and Cronenberg did, like, analyzing a scene, Vanity Fair things, where, like, they write on the screen and stuff like that, which is very funny. Particularly, there's just a point where they doodle on Vigo's face, just, like, draw a mustache and shit, which is very funny. But it was weird realizing, even though this isn't that long ago, but it almost feels like centuries ago at this point, they talk about the fact that, like, this movie came out not too long after Roe v. Wade got overturned, which is fascinating to think about, just given the fact that, like, we're talking about this movie that's about policing bodies, and that's just a thing that was going on in our real world.
Right.
Where it's just like, and we're getting rid of this statute that was here for a while, because fuck women, we don't give a shit about their reproductive rights to any degree. We'll tell you how you can use your interior organs.
Right.
We're going to tell you how that works.
And yeah, the idea of bodily autonomy. And in this movie, though, it is definitely this, idea where you can tell Cronenberg is kind of clearly upset by that idea. But at the same time, he is not presenting... There's the whole angle, of course, of people growing new digestive systems to be able to process plastic, because obviously we are filling our oceans with plastic, and we just have just waste everywhere. And you can tell that Cronenberg is incredibly horrified by that idea in particular. And I don't know. I just find it interesting that Cronenberg is presenting all these ideas, but not exactly telling you this is good, this is bad, right? Like it's in this kind of gray zone, and it's one of the things I find so fascinating about this is how many questions it does raise, and the whole eating plastic thing, which is what the movie starts on with this boy eating like a trash can as he takes bites out of it, and how there is, you completely see the reaction of, oh, well, this is human evolution, right? We need to, as Scott Speedman says, eat our own waste. We have created so much waste, now we need to, eat it to survive, basically. And you kind of get where he's coming from, because, yeah, we have definitely, just destroyed the planet with, plastics. But the way that Cronenberg kind of underlines that but this is the future that we're leaving for our children, and how really, really unsettling and horrifying that idea is.
Which is really contrasted with, you had Scott Speedman, but there's also his ex-wife, played by Lily Kowalski, who at the beginning of the movie, after she sees her child eating plastic, immediately turns from, having any kind of empathy for him to killing him.
Smothering with a pillow.
Right. And it comes back at a certain point, Vigo talks to her, and she's just very blunt about, that thing wasn't human anymore. Right. That wasn't, a human person. And I think that the movie does a fascinating job of making that, her bluntness very unsettling, but at the same time also kind of, making that point of view, at the very least, understandable from the perspective of somebody who's I can't fathom the idea that, I am connected to something that would eat plastic at this point.
Right.
Very much othering this new evolution, which I think makes it, like you mentioned, kind of moral grayness. Because Scott Speedman's technically, he was this, beautiful child. He was the next step. He, has some kind of empathy, but also no concern about, mourning at all. He's just that's a shame that happened, It's a bummer. More just because of his cause, as opposed to like actually giving a shit about his child who was horribly murdered.
Right.
Really.
And again, the moral dilemma where, his mother is like, this is horrible, what we're doing. Like, I don't, like, she's essentially like, I don't want my child to live in a future where he has to eat plastic to survive. Like, that is, like, a horrible future we've created. And Scott Speedman's character who kind of views that as, like, but that's the next step of human evolution, as it were. And yeah, the movie doesn't really answer any of those questions. It just brings up these really fascinating and, again, these conversations that feel very modern and feel like they are of the now in the 2020s. It really feels like these are the conversations that we kind of should be having about, like, just, again, bodies and waste and how in the future of our children and stuff like that.
And while we're just here, I want to just briefly bring this up. Fucking Scott Speedman was the true surprise of this movie to me. In that everyone else in this cast has proven they've been, like, capable. This guy, best known for, like, the first couple Underworld movies, or he was the lead guy in The Strangers. The block of wood that Liv Tyler and these, like, hooded figures are around in the original 2008 Strangers. He was just kind of, like, the epitome to me of, like, early 2000s, like, just guy who stands there and delivers lines. As opposed to here, he actually is delivering, like, a weird performance, like a fasting performance, where, like, you see him mostly just eating the plastic bars most of the time, which we should shout out the plastic candy bars.
They look kind of good. I'll admit it.
I mean, it's especially interesting in the post I Saw the TV Glow world, which, if you're, by the way, a Cronenberg fan, very much recommend I Saw the TV Glow.
Yeah.
Has a lot of Videodrome vibes, but that kind of, like, weird pink, like, plasticky look to it. It does kind of feel like, I don't know, like, there's part of me that loves that synthetic look to it. That's almost just like, it feels almost like the next evolution of a Pop-Tart, basically.
Well, yeah.
Especially the way it's packaged and everything. But yeah, he's such a fascinating performance here, where he's, like, just kind of, like, crouched in corners eating his plastic bars, like, really playing with his hair a lot in particular. Does a lot of, like, putting his hands through his hair and just going kind of, like, mad. And then when he ends up having his, like, breakdown, it's fascinating because it's after, the first time he feels like any true emotion is after seeing autopsy performed on his dead son, which he agreed to do. And it's not because that's actually happening. It's because they looked inside and it's like, oh, that digestive system that he created isn't there. It's like all these false organs that were apparently planned by Kristen Stewart, as revealed in the great detective back and forth that I love so much. And it's just this fascinating thing where, like, his regret and sorrow is about just like, oh, my vision is ruined, as opposed to, like, my son died. And he promptly gets drilled the fuck out of his skull. That is, like, some of the most brutal, like, harkening back to the blood and gore of Cronenberg.
Yeah.
Truly, which is, like, it's so blunt, just, like, couple drills in the head, he's out, and router and burst move on.
And it's, like, the sound, too. You get, like, the fleshy sound, but then, like, the sound when it gets into his skull, that, like, kind of sound. It's very, very disturbing, and he's very good in this movie. I think I really love his performance, especially, like, the scene where he's showing them the body when the body's in the fridge. I think his performance in that scene is, like, really, really great. I'll be honest with you, I think before I saw this movie, I didn't really know who Scott Speedman was. I think I'm really showing my
I don't blame
my
you.
age
If you're
there,
below the age of, like, I don't know, 28, you have no idea. You've never seen a Scott Speedman movie, probably, and I get that. And even I, once again, mostly just know him as, like, a block of wood who was in early 2000s movies, basically.
Yeah, should we do Underworld full franchise at some point?
I kind of stick up for the Underworld movies.
Really? I've never
I
seen
think
any
most
of
of them
them.
are actually kind of good. Yeah, most people have the, like, the Resident Evil movies are good, actually, because Paul W.S. Anderson is our god kind of take. I'm more that way about Underworld. There's only, like, one that I outright hate of those Underworld movies. But he's only in the first two.
How many are there?
And he's kind of like the weird... There are 5?
5, yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Weird. Okay.
Weird movies. But you know what, Brian? We've talked about most of the cast, but there's one notable exception. We haven't really talked about Leia Sadu that much.
Oh, yes.
Despite her being, like, the second lead of this fucking movie.
Yeah.
How do you feel about Sadu in general?
I love Leia Seydoux. I think she is also one of the most fascinating actresses working today. I mean, I remember, I think I definitely first saw her in Blue is the Warmest Color, of course, but over time, I think she's become really fascinating, and, you know, she was a Bond girl in, you know, those last two movies that a lot of people don't like. I like those movies, but, you know, it's also been fascinating to see her go into, like, the Wes Anderson camp, right? She was in the French Dispatch, and then, obviously, I'm, you know, as a gamer, I love her in Death Stranding and just all the pictures she takes with Hideo Kojima because he knows everyone. He also, while I'm on Kojima, he constantly wears a shirt from Crimes of the Future that says "Body is reality" with like a heart on it, which I think is so cool. And I love how much he like reps this movie in particular. But anyways, Seydoux is just so great. I mean, she's so visually striking, like the moment you see her in any movie. And I think her performance in this is so fascinating. And, you know, I think she's kind of underrated in this movie because Vigo is so great and also giving a weird performance. Kristen Stewart is giving a weird performance. But she is super underrated in this thing. I love just, I don't know how kind of tender her performance feels a lot of the time, like when she like first wakes up Saul at the beginning of the movie, where it is, there's just this kind of genteel nature to her that I love. Yeah, how do you feel about Lea Seydoux?
Well, I think someone's forgetting, at least for me, like the breakout performance for her was in Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol.
Of course, right, yeah,
where she has one of, I think, particularly the best hand-to-hand combat scenes with Paula Patton in that movie.
Yeah.
That whole sequence where, like, her fucking death where she gets kicked out of that fucking window is still one of my, like, favorite moments in any Mission Impossible movie. Yeah, I remember, like, finding her fascinating there. And, you know, like you mentioned, one of the most visually striking, I think one of the most underrated visually striking actresses, like, working in, like, any movies today, quite frankly. Like, she's such a fascinating presence, and I think she's been used to varying degrees. Like, I would say I'm someone who is not a fan of how she's implemented in, at least Spectre. I think that definitely feels like, trying to make her into a Bond girl feels like it doesn't quite work for her. Because what I like about Seydoux in general is she has that kind of, like, you know, beautiful, striking demeanor, but she's gonna, like, fucking destroy you somehow, whether it is, like, emotionally or physically. She will just pounce and fucking wreck you, basically. Or pounce in a way that feels even more intimate in a certain way, like in The French Dispatch. I love she's in a bunch of Wes Anderson movies. It's probably my favorite use of her.
Yeah,
like her and Del Toro have this weird connection. It feels very authentic, just like two people who are like ravenous for each other.
that line she has where she's like, "Stop being a baby," like,
yes, right. Which I think is very important to this movie, where she is kind of playing, you know, her relationship with Vigo is like, they always talk about, like, we're performance partners. Right. We're not, like, you know, intimate, but at the same time, she is kind of like, you know, playing lover, mother, collaborator, like, so much to, like, Vigo, like, his real major tether to anything, his umbilical cord, basically, in terms of, like, the weird kind of connective, weird body horror tissue. She is, like, the one kind of connection he has to any kind of, like, life and also human connection or anything in this movie.
Yeah, and she's also the one who, like, deals with, like, all the technical stuff. Like, she deals with, like, the what's that thing called, the SARC, like, autopsy machine. She, like, gets it fixed and everything. Also, she's also, like, his tech crew, basically doing the lighting crew, like. No fog. They should get a fog machine.
We didn't see it earlier, but she was probably setting up all those fucking TV sets while he's just kind of like, I'm writhing in the corner. He's like, I gotta fucking haul these TV sets in here, make sure it's set to Body is reality. Right. I gotta do all this fucking I'm a roadie too. Like, we couldn't hire a third person. Before, when this was originally gonna go into production for, like, this version of it in, like, 2021, Natalie Portman was cast in that part, and she had to leave because of, like, concerns about COVID. And actually, Seydoux was in the Kristen Stewart part during that phase of production. And then when things shifted, she shifted over to this part. She ultimately plays in the final movie, and Kristen Stewart got this part, which I feel is fascinating. I think she could do the Kristen Stewart bit of this.
Yeah.
And I think Portman could potentially handle the Seydoux element. She kind of feels like she would be sort of like almost the agent for Viggo Mortensen, just like, yeah, here's the connections, like have my people call your people, and we'll get you in contact with Viggo.
I can only imagine what voice she would have done for this movie, Natalie Portman.
Oh, good lord, yeah. But Sadu does a fascinating job of like being all these front-facing things, like his agent, his mother, his his connection to the outside world. But also, I do love the certain point where like she just is like walking around amongst the other performance artists, which we haven't talked about. But I mean, this isn't with Sadu, but there's the whole ear guy, which Viggo visits, which is the most Cronenberg-y thing. The thing they sold this movie on, I think, rightly.
They did, yeah. It was
like
all
weird
over the trailer.
Man. Right, just like who has his lips and eyes sewed shut. But also when she sees like the one lady who like cuts basically like gills into the side of her face on her forehead. And there's also that one random lady who's like getting a pizza cutter put into her foot.
Oh, that one actually. Out of all the weird fucked up things in this movie, that's the thing where I had to look away from, because she's like cutting into her like bone on her foot. Ugh, so gross.
Right, but there's that whole point where like she especially goes up to like the lady who has like all the weird like cuts. And she just speaks about the fact that it's like, oh, I was so like enlightened by what you were doing, and I want to like have that connection. And that's where she gets her weird like Klingon ridges in her forehead.
Yeah.
Which I just love that. That's just like she's like the most that she's willing to go for with like because she's always been like the tech person, like I mentioned. She's always like the person who's like operating the like weird gummy remote.
Yeah.
Knows all this stuff. And the one time she does any kind of like, I want to be adventurous, I want to get something added in, she gets like the ridges, which feels kind of like in this universe the equivalent of like having a heart tattoo that has mother written in it.
Sure.
Like it's the smallest thing, which they reference in the movie, which is one of my favorite things. We talk about like the tattoos with Viggo, and he's like, oh, what should we get? A tattoo that says a little heart or mother or some weird shit like that. Yeah, I just love the fact that she eventually like she wants to dive into like sort of having her own body experimented with, but it's like the smallest thing possible because she doesn't want to like fully commit to like weird Viggo shit. She kind of talks more game about like, oh, I'm willing to like cut Viggo open and expose his organs, but I don't want to go too far beyond like these ridges. I'm dipping my toes in, basically. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like getting like a piercing or whatever, like getting like a septum piercing or something.
Right.
Yeah, you mentioned that that like weird device she uses to do the surgery. That's also, I want to touch that thing. I don't know. It's just this weird fleshy, as you said, gummy looking like thing. And it looks so cool. It like lights up and has all different kind of colors and stuff. And I love just all of the devices in this movie. And Cronenberg like excels at this kind of stuff, right? Like I always think about that scene in Videodrome where he has to put like the headset over his head, and just how fucking cool that like VR, like proto VR headset looks. Or obviously like the machine from The Fly. Or, of course, like I mentioned, the typewriter that comes to life from Naked Lunch.
It says hi to Peter Weller, and just like, hi.
God, that's a weird movie.
Or even, like, the thing that I kept thinking of, honestly, with the gummy thing is really more the tech that we see in Existence.
Yes.
Where it's, like, it is kind of, like, fleshy, but there's ports to it, which I find fascinating. Especially the fact that they're dealing with, like, seemingly older tech.
Yes.
Like, they're dealing with, like, something that feels at least like a generation behind. Because even, like, the two... Router and Burst kind of talk about like, oh yeah, they stopped making these before we even joined the company.
I love that.
This is like out of date, but it's like they're so fascinated by it, which I think is like interesting because it feels like they're kind of like taking the remains of like the previous generations of tech and kind of like dealing with it to like progress their art forward, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I love that scene just because I love just any kind of lore building, and it's like you're building lore off of this weird fucked up device that you created. It's so cool. But I also just love, like, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but how analog everything feels, and especially all the devices and stuff like that. They all have a very tactile feel to them, and even during those like surgery scenes, like you can tell like the blades are CGI, right? Like there's some budgetary constraints there, but it all just looks so unique and like gorgeous. Like I love that shot. I think was also in the trailer where Viggo's like stomach open, like the device opens into like a window of his stomach, and then like the same for his face, and it like does like kind of thing. Yeah, just all that stuff is just so fascinating and cool to me, and it's part of the stuff that I love about like the kind of sci-fi angle of this movie, which is, again, it's there, but it is mostly like the devices, and then a lot of it focuses on the more of the body stuff and the physiological stuff. But yeah, all that stuff is great as usual. Cronenberg does.
Though I gotta say, kind of just disappointment. I get, why we kind of move away from this angle, but they introduced this idea of the inner beauty pageant, which is so fascinating, and especially like the weird thing with the doctor character that like Vigo gets the little zipper installed, in there, and he talks about. I love that one line where he talks about the I'm in the category of best original organ with no known function. That's the category he jokingly brings up. But I gotta say, man, I kind of wanted to see that inner beauty pageant. It's a bummer we kind of don't see that. I feel like that would be just a full display of like all the fucking freaks that Cronenberg could possibly put out there. And you could even tie in like the autopsy bit. That could be kind of like their weird performance art adjacent to the inner beauty pageant. I want to see more fucking freaks with weird body attachments, Cronenberg.
Yeah. We mentioned the ear guy earlier, and I like how much like they put like a lot of emphasis on him and like the marketing and stuff like that, because he is very like a Cronenberg creation basically. But I love how in the movie itself he's kind of viewed as like pretentious and just kind of like, oh, like some of the ears don't even work, and like he's just kind of like whatever. Right,
they're all for
like,
show.
Yeah, he's like a poser almost.
Right.
But
he's not in it for the art, man. He's just in it for the exposure.
Right. He's like commercial. He's the commercial version of like what they're doing and stuff. Because like they have that scene where he mentions it, where I think where he's like, oh yeah, the ear guy again, and Lea Seydoux like, are you jealous? And he's like, well yeah, but he still kind of sucks. Like,
He's like the Forever 21 of weird fucked up performance artists. Like he's gone mainstream. Ear guy. Yeah. Everyone has TikToks of ear guy.
Right. I wonder, do they have like sponsorships? Like, how does it work? Like, does Life Firmware or whatever like sponsor any of them?
I don't know. He probably, if he could talk, he would talk, like, because his mouth is so much shit. He would probably say just like, use my code ear. Once again, which he is invading on our turf. We want the Life Firmware sponsorship.
We do.
How fucking dare you, ear guy?
I want that chair, that bone and teeth chair.
Send us a free sample.
Yeah.
We'll sit and like eat, I don't know, whatever.
Also just love like the look of the food when he's eating. It looks like the food from like 2001, where it's like, well, what do they eat in the future? It's just like green slush or whatever, like green slop.
Like paste,
like, yeah.
Basically. Almost kind of reminds me also of the weird like fake food in Hook, when they have like the imaginary food fight. And it's all just like rainbow colored paste.
Oh,
that they like throw at each other.
I do not remember a lot of Hook. I should watch Hook again. I've seen it once, but it's been a while. I really liked it when I saw it. I should give it another visit.
Yeah. Well, for the record, I'm not a huge Hook fan, despite seeing that movie a lot as a child. Sure. I don't know. Put a pin in. We might cover that movie at some point. There's a lot to talk about with Hook. But anyway, we gotta talk about this fucking ending, which is, I think, one of my favorite Cronenbergian endings of a movie. But is there any stuff we didn't mention you also want to shout out, any other like bits before we get to that ending?
I do. I want to talk about Howard Shore a little bit, because he does the music for this movie. He's done the music for a lot of Cronenberg movies.
This is their 18th collaboration.
Good Lord, that's so many.
That's most of his movies, pretty much. I think like, I don't know, since Shivers, I want to say, right? Is that the first one?
I believe The Brood is the first one. So ever since The Brood, they've been working together. And it's very weird for me, because I mainly, when I think of Howard Shore, I of course think of, we mentioned it earlier, The Lord of the Rings. And the score for those movies is like the most incredible, like just grand, epic, bombastic, fantasy score that has ever existed. And then, watching all these Cronenberg movies, it's just weird to think that he actually kind of mostly does these like droning, oppressive, electronic scores for his movies, or something like the Crash score, which is one of my favorites, which is just this like all guitar, and it's gorgeous and so like sad, and has this like, really matches the tone of all of his movies.
Or even like, by contrast to any of those, even The Fly, which I think is like the closest to kind of like The Lord of the Rings in terms of it's massive and bombastic. It's one of my favorite scores. It kind of evokes like opera to the degree that Howard Shore adapted it into an opera, literally.
Oh, that's so cool.
With that fucking movie, yeah. Howard Shore is one of the most fascinating composers in terms of his career, where you see like stuff like that, and even like when he's starting to work with Cronenberg, he's still doing his like weird weekend gig of being the first band leader of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, that's weird.
Which is still fucking wild, right? It just has like he has such a diverse range in terms of his musical ability. He's like one of our most like really multi-talented and diverse composers out there. And I think particularly in this movie, like in that little interview thing I talked about, Cronenberg mentioned like he collaborated with Shore in this movie with just being like, I want to feel like the soundscape kind of bleeds together in a weird way where people aren't sure, like, are they hearing your score or are they hearing like the weird sound outside in this weird world, or like this feels like one of his most kind of like disguised, kind of like blended into the background kind of scores in a good way.
Yes.
Where it feels kind of just like a piece with like the kind of sound mass that's going on. As we mentioned, like with this crumbling society, it kind of just works where it's just like, I don't know, that could be a score bit, or that could be somebody like screaming to death in the background, who knows?
Yeah, or
doesn't really fucking matter.
Or like, is it the score, or is it like the sounds of all these machines working, or something like that?
Right.
Yeah, it's a really gorgeous score, and I love Howard Shore so much, and I just find him really fascinating. I love all of the scores he's done for Cronenberg's movies, which range from like these weird electronic to like a more orchestral score. Like I always think of I believe Madame Butterfly has like a more kind of traditional kind of like orchestral score, but yeah, he fucking rules. I love Howard Shore. He's the best.
Yeah, also one of the few people to score a Tim Burton movie that isn't Danny Elfman, because he did Ed Wood.
Oh fuck, that's a great
which is also a great score. That's the thing. He also will just like kind of jump in for anybody. Like he's worked with Scorsese a couple times.
Right.
He did the score for like Big, which is a very big like comedy score. Or That Thing You Do, another Tom Hanks collaboration. Like he'll just kind of sub in for anybody, and just he really adapts his musical talents to like any genre.
Yes.
In a really fascinating way that feels very unheralded. He scored a Kevin Smith film, Bryan. He did the score for Dogma.
Wow. Yeah.
Yep.
It's
Which that score's doing a lot of heavy lifting for that movie that isn't very visually expressive, shockingly, for Kevin Smith.
Yeah. And then he of course just creates like, the greatest pieces of music of all time with the Lord of the Rings scores, and like, God, yeah, he's so fascinating. I do also just want to briefly talk about, because it goes into the finale of the movie and the final shot of the movie. This is a really gorgeous looking movie shot by Douglas Koch, who has not done a lot of movies, but he shot The Shrouds, the upcoming Cronenberg movie. And there's something about, all the stuff we talked about earlier, this kind of like coldness and this like dead quality to all of his movies, but this one especially because it's a lot newer. I'm pretty sure it's shot on digital. It just looks really, really, really great, and I think, his movies always look great, but it's just, I don't know, it's different here, but it still looks really fantastic. And the last shot of this movie is like, I think, fucking iconic and legendary. I like, it's transcendent to me.
Well, I think particularly with just the way that he captures the rust of this movie. Like, this is also a big credit to like the set design and stuff like that, but this movie is just constantly covered in like a rust or like barnacles almost, which feels like there's kind of something like encroaching on like the society that feels like, oh, it's even like the buildings look like they're like rusting away.
Yeah.
It just feels like things are being like decayed just by like lack of, not even just, the society crumbling, but just more people like not really giving a shit at all. I'm just like, this is the least of our concern, is making these buildings look good.
Well, there's like the meeting point, your favorite scenes in the movie with the detective and Viggo Mortensen, like that, like,
yes,
location just looks disgusting. Like it's so like, it's this like decayed like shipyard kind of thing, and it just looks so sickly and gross and everything. Yeah, I love it. But yeah, should we get into the ending, I guess?
Let's talk about this ending.
Yeah.
So after, this like big autopsy scene, which we kind of referenced earlier, but for Cronenberg even, this feels a bit upsetting, seeing this small child corpse be cut into and unveiled, and just the shock everyone has is more just like, oh, tattooed organs. those are ones that we are aware of. This is all a lie, I guess.
Right.
Sadu's like giving her big monologue, and it's just like, it's very like, upsetting. We kind of like move, into like that final scene that really teared me up, where the detective talked to Viggo Mortensen again the last time and referenced a cool thing that Kristen Stewart was kind of like involved in, even though we just saw her like kind of fly away. That great scene where like he falls off the bed and she comes over to him and talks about, she's like, what's it like to feel pain? It's this horrible thing that also is like exciting, because it's like I love that little bit of connection there where she kind of is just like, it puts together everything about Sadu's character in terms of like, oh, she's doing this because like she has this connection to a guy who can do something that like no one else can do, which is feel horrible all the time as opposed to feeling completely empty. She wants that, like, I want to feel like shit instead of feeling nothing. That's what I want. That happens, and then he tries to eat breakfast the next day in that breakfast chair, and it's just not going down smooth. So she ends up opening a little box that has some of those plastic bars that Scott Steven was eating earlier. She ends up giving it to Viggo, just like, maybe it's finally time we just experiment with this, see if this is like what will help you. Then Viggo takes a bite out of it, and it's just an ecstasy.
Yeah.
Finally, some good fucking food.
Yeah, and then he does basically the Passion of Joan of Arc shot as the finale, which is so incredibly like profound and beautiful. I mean, just seeing like the single tear like fall as like it cuts to black, and you see just like his eyes open, and like he finally is like satiated, it feels like, and it is loaded with so much, I think, because you have this kind of constant, like earlier in the movie in one of like the meetings with the detective, Viggo says like, I'm like horrified by what's happening to the human body. That's why I keep cutting my body up, because he's like, he is horrified by this idea of like new organs growing and the human body like evolving in some way. I don't even know whether to categorize it as like hopeful or like sad, but it is just this incredibly profound moment where he basically has to accept like who he is and what his body is doing. And I don't know, it really grows on me the more that I sit with the ending. But this time I watched it, it really, really moved me, I think.
It's a great visual way of really building on something that, I keep joking about, like the detective scenes, but they bring that up at one point in the final detective scene. The whole thing about like, Scott Speedman died, so maybe the cause is gone, but also maybe he's a martyr that can get the cause to keep going. Like, that's, that idea is interesting, but I think this visually presents a really interesting way of like really expounding upon the idea that like, oh yeah, this thing that we kept going back and forth about, like, eating plastics, how is that gonna like really work? Is this a new human evolution? What is that really gonna do for people? They present that sort of theory throughout the whole movie, and then Viggo just kind of like just says like, well, if you can't beat them, join them, and ends up like eating this plastic bar, and it's the first time he's not felt like shit. It's the first time he has truly like eaten something that fills him, which adds like, like we mentioned, like all these depressing ideas about like, somebody eating plastics. We haven't mentioned somehow while talking about plastics, the whole microplastic horrible nightmare scenario that's kind of like brought about
Sure.
In the modern parlance. And this feels kind of like, like there's all those implications about like, oh, this is going to be like so horrible, it's going to lead to like disease, and there's all this like the horrible implications of like having plastic in the human system. But then also because of like how Viggo's evolved at this point, how much he's just felt so awful trying to eat like what is considered traditional food, and it's just like really worked out. It's been so fascinating, especially as somebody who's, I don't know, maybe in their 30s and has had realizations of like, I can't just eat certain garbage I used to eat anymore. Right. This is just him finally like having just a meal that doesn't like hurt him, and in fact even like fascinates him, even though there's all these horrible implications to like what this food is. It's at the same time just like, well, it fucking worked for me. And it's like you mentioned, there's that weird ambiguity about like what this means on a macro level, but on the micro level of like this guy who's felt like shit the whole time, right, just finally like having a single tear of just like ecstasy, and just like, having his weird Anton ego, like, I ate this thing and it's brought me back to childhood innocence kind of moment for him, is a plastic bar. It's just that, it's like you mentioned, it really encapsulates all the like big questions the movie's like really bringing up in one beautiful image. That's also just really fucked up when you think about it from a certain perspective.
Yeah, that, and I think there's a line earlier in the movie that I think also kind of weirdly encapsulates a lot of the themes of the movie, which is when Vigo's talking to the mother of the child, and he asks her, like, if the police did an autopsy, what do you think they would find? And her response is outer space. There's so much, I think, there, and I think it's so much of what he is kind of getting at with just what the fuck this means for, like, humanity, right? And also just there's a lot of talk in the movie as well, like the mother character talks about, like, no, this thing isn't human, right? Like, human beings are not meant to eat plastic. Like I mentioned earlier, just this scene of ecstasy for him, and he can finally have, like, some relief. Like when I have a ginger ale after having a large vanilla milkshake the previous night.
That's true. I've seen him drink this ginger ale and have that exact same ecstasy, just like
every time.
One single tear.
Man, it's so good. Seagram's. They should sponsor us.
No, we're going firmly for life firmware. That's the horse we're gonna completely attach ourselves to. That's the big whale, yes.
But just like the implications that this has for humanity, and I don't know. It's kind of horrifying, and yeah, the whole microplastics thing and conversation definitely feel this. It's what makes this movie, I think, feel very prescient and very current in terms of what it's discussing. Just what a final shot! I think it's incredible.
And it's also so weird that we're getting this kind of like very current thing from a director who's like what, now in his 70s?
Yeah, he's a boomer, right? He was born in the 40s. It's weird, but also it feels like someone who has had children and has raised children and has had to sort of now in, like, I guess what he views as like the end of his life is sort of thinking like, well, what kind of world have we left for our children? And like, is this okay? I don't know. Like, what are we going to do? I don't know. And it's the movie raising all of these questions, and of course it doesn't have answer for them, but I think that's my favorite kind of movie, I think.
By the way, Cronenberg, 81 currently. Jesus. So he was in his 70s when he made this, technically, and put it out there. But yeah, it doesn't feel it at all, though. If you see any like interviews, like we just saw like footage and an interview with him for The Shrouds over at Cannes. Seems very spry.
Yeah.
While at the same time being very bitter. I love he talks about meeting Martin Scorsese.
Yes.
And Marty talked to him, just told him, like, you look like a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon.
I think he said plastic surgeon, or did he say Beverly Hills gynecologist? It was one of those two.
I believe it was one of those two, which is what prompted him to do the cameo that he has in The Fly, where he plays the doctor in the weird dream sequence where Gene Davis is giving birth.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think on that note, Brian, we should probably give our like wrap up final thoughts on Crimes of the Future. So your final thoughts on the 2022 David Cronenberg film Crimes of the Future.
Yeah, I mean, I love this movie. I think it gets better for me the more that I watch it, and I think it becomes more, I keep using this word, but more prescient the more that I watch it. And the more I watch it, the more I think the ideas that this movie is talking about and discussing feel more prevalent, I think, and they feel a lot more just fascinating and horrifying. And I love David Cronenberg's style, that steeliness, that just dead quality to his movies, that oppressive quality to his movies, and all of his weird fucked up devices that he builds, and just the way that he has handled like science fiction, right? Because he has a lot of movies I would categorize as science fiction, but he is not a kind of sci-fi director in that sense. And I'm just always fascinated by how he incorporates sci-fi elements into his movies while also having ideas of, death and mortality. And, this movie, kind of like Crash, is about this kind of insular community and how a character is kind of brought into that community to kind of just get a glimpse at it, right? Like, Crash is a movie about a guy getting a glimpse into these weird people who like to fuck during like car accidents and stuff like that. And this is kind of a similar movie in that way, but it also has lots of callbacks to like stuff like Videodrome and Existence and stuff like that. But, you know, obviously still has a lot of the qualities that his dramas have. And I think it feels like a late era movie. I think there was a lot of talk around the time it came out that like, oh, is this kind of his last movie? It definitely feels like his last movie. While we were watching it, I think you and I also talked about like, if this is his final movie, that's a way to go. I think that's a hell of a swan song. But he clearly has more to say, and I'm fascinated by what he has to say, because he's always had fascinating ideas over, you know, the human body and, you know, the evolution of the human body, and just all of those ideas are really fascinating. And he's become one of my favorite filmmakers, and I love this movie, and I'm just really, really fascinated to see what he does. And yeah, he made one of the best movies of the decade. So yeah, I'm happy David Cronenberg's finally back.
Especially like within the span of like 50 years of a career.
Right.
Like he's hitting his 5th decade, and he's just doing something that's fascinating. I wouldn't quite say I love it nearly as much as you did, despite my love of all the detective scenes that I just keep espousing about. Honestly, that's like my one issue with the movie in comparison to just all the other stuff that I agree with you about, just like how it's very much of this particular moment. But and even like the prescient element you're talking about, it's that kind of thing that I think is very key to hard sci-fi, which is the 5 minutes in the future movie.
Yes.
Which is to say, like, it's prescient, but only in the way that, like, he can see a couple steps ahead, as opposed to, like, in the vast distant future. It's like, nah, I don't know, man. This is kind of like, we're maybe approaching this sooner rather than later,
Right.
which I think is what's really fascinating. It's like you mentioned, it feels kind of like one of the few movies about sort of like in a modern age where we're kind of worried about how long the future's going to last necessarily, and what that future's going to look like in the next, you know, decade or forward. It feels like it's him kind of like being one of the few guys to really put in on the fact that, like, well, you know, the world's probably not going to completely collapse right away. It's going to be a gradual thing.
Right.
You might not even see it in your lifetime, but we're just seeing, like, basically this decay that will end up being the next generation's big, massive fucking problem, really. Which is the sad thing. It's like you're just going to see, like, the lead up to that. And you might, you know, not be around for that necessarily. You might end up being dust by the time that happens. But you can just see, like, the gradual buildup of it, which I think is what's fascinating with this movie, where it's dealing with all this while also having incredibly entertaining elements with, like, all these performances from your, you know, sad Sith Snuggie Vigo with his, which we didn't really talk about, but, like, that fucking Snuggie looks extremely comfortable, but also makes him look simultaneously like a Sith Lord and a fucking ninja.
He looks like a ninja.
Or, of course, like we mentioned, fucking Kristen Stewart as a human mouse person who wants to, like, fuck Viggo Mortensen. And just all these other, like, weird elements that are all around. There's, like, so much entertainment value you can get out of this. It's like somebody, you know, coming back to, like, his kind of, like, body horror aesthetics, but with a completely different vision than you'd expect. This isn't him resting on the laurels of, like, all right, I'm going to have someone's head explode. Someone's going to go in a teleportation device. You know, just playing the hits. This isn't Cronenberg, like, returning to that and just kind of, like, doing something very typical of him. Even for his weird atypical style, this feels very odd.
Yes.
In a way that's, like, incredibly engaging. Feels like a director moving forward while kind of, like, putting his foot in the older stuff that he was doing. And, yeah, I'm excited to see whatever he, you know, the Shrouds or whatever he might potentially do after that. Just want to see more of this guy who has had an incredibly consistent career. Like, even the Cronenberg movies I don't love necessarily, I find fascinating. Like, I'm not, like, probably my least favorite traditional narrative movies of his is Cosmopolis, and even that is, like, incredibly interesting.
Movie. Yeah.
Right, incredibly fascinating, and has weird turns from so many people, like Paul Giamatti showing up at the end of that fucking movie.
He's
Crazy shit.
incredible in that movie. Yeah.
Wild bits. But yeah, so even, like, with whatever missteps I might have with some of Cronenberg's particularly more recent movies, I think Crimes of the Future just proves, like, this guy's still got so much in him. However many production companies he needs to fucking get to, like, make whatever next movie. We didn't mention that, but this is another movie with, like, 15 production logos in front of it before we get to the opening credits.
It is, yeah. Which, but it's also put out by Neon, which, again, it's,
Yes.
you know, kind of the hope, I think, of a lot of these kind of, like, boutique indie distributors like A24 and Neon and stuff like that is that like they will put out stuff by like David Cronenberg, right? Like these filmmakers who, you know, over the past decade have just not been able to get their movies made at a studio level.
But yeah, on that note, you know what? Let's transition over into our usual segment, Between the Lines. So Between the Lines is a segment that Bryan and I do every episode in which, you know, along with talking about the main movie, we bring up another movie that's related in some way. Could be, you know, directly related to the movie that we're talking about, or could be just maybe an alternate choice for, in this case, the N for New for like a hard sci-fi sort of season. And Bryan, you're going first. What is your recommendation for Between the Lines?
My recommendation this week is not very similar to this movie. It actually has more in line with the movie covered last week. I still want to talk about it because it is a newer movie. I also feel like I'm picking, for these recommendations, just picks from my favorite directors, because last week I had Steven Soderbergh, and this week I have James Gray, because I'm recommending Ad Astra, which came out in 2019, starring Brad Pitt, and it is basically Apocalypse Now in space. So, if anyone doesn't know, Brad Pitt plays this astronaut, also set in kind of the near future, undetermined near future, and he is this astronaut who is hired to sort of go find his dad. He is going to send a message to his dad, and who has been missing for like decades, who is also an astronaut, played by Tommy Lee Jones, and he goes on a quest basically to go find his father, and it is an absolute masterpiece. I adore this movie. I adore James Gray in general. He's one of my favorite filmmakers working today, and the idea of him making a sci-fi movie, a space sci-fi movie in particular, was so fascinating to me. And when I saw it, I was completely blown away, because I think this movie is incredibly intimate and incredibly personal. It feels much more like a Terrence Malick movie than, you know, Star Wars or something like that. And it really becomes like a Terrence Malick movie in terms of the voiceover, the way that he's kind of cutting together images, and the kind of montage that he does eventually in the movie. But it is also a movie that depicts the future of space travel as this incredibly cynical and, you know, kind of disgusting capitalist hell. One of my favorite shots of the movie is when he goes to the moon and there's a tiny little Applebee's there, and it's but I really love this movie. I think it's one of Brad Pitt's best performances of recent years. Also resulted in one of the great headlines. I think it was Karen Hahn for Polygon wrote the headline, "Brad Astra is Sad Astra about his dad Astra," which I think about all the time. But you also, again, you have Tommy Lee Jones in here, who is just fucking killing it. He is so good in this movie. You also have Ruth Negga in here, John Ortiz. Always great to see John Ortiz. And also, another reason I picked this movie is it stars the late, great Donald Sutherland in a small supporting role. He's so great, has such a great presence in this movie. R.I.P. Donald Sutherland, just one of the greats.
Truly.
Also, you know, incredible cinematography by Hoyt van Hoytema, who is kind of also one of the best working cinematographers. Yeah, is this movie about, you know, toxic masculinity being passed down essentially by generations? It's also a movie about, again, like the future of space travel. It's also a movie about, you know, depression and kind of this deep just emptiness that you can feel as a person in the modern world, even in light of all this kind of technological progress and stuff like that. My favorite kind of plot for a movie is people hire a guy to go find someone. You know, it's the Apocalypse Now kind of plot. I just love that idea for some reason of being sent on this journey of go find this person. And yeah, it's one of my favorite movies of the year it came out. It's one of my favorite movies of the past decade, maybe. I love it. Ad Astra. Yeah. Do you like this movie? Do you like James Gray? I don't know if we ever talked about James Gray, really.
I haven't seen all of Gray's movies, but I've really loved most of what I've seen. I mean, I wouldn't say Ad Astra is my absolute favorite. I need to pull up the James Gray real quick. I mean, because I love Lost City of Z.
Yeah.
I've got movie rules. We Own the Night is an incredible,
yes,
very grounded
absolutely
movie from him as well. Yeah, honestly, aside from, I wasn't huge on Armageddon time, but I also haven't seen stuff like The Immigrant or Two Lovers.
Two Lovers is
which
is very top tier. James Gray, I think, it's such a phenomenal movie.
Right, but still, this is like such a weird turn for him to do Ad Astra.
Yeah,
or like it's like him doing like a bigger budget kind of like space movie that could only really happen because of like the Plan B stuff with Brad Pitt,
right?
Most likely. But yeah, it feels so fascinating, especially where like we technically couldn't do it for our N for New based on our weird arbitrary rules,
right?
Because it came out like September 2019, so like very close, but not quite. But I mean, regardless, I think it does feel kind of like one of the last examples prior to, you know, we mentioned that kind of like cutting off point of the pandemic of like, you know, a hard sci-fi being done in a bigger space, like a big movie star and all this other shit. Like, I get why it wasn't commercially successful, because this movie is much weirder than you would anticipate, like, a big-budget space movie with Brad Pitt to be, because there's, like, the whole baboon sequence inside the fucking spaceship, which is wild. The moon rover chase, which is just amazing, and has little to no, like, sound design in it because of just the, there's no sound in space, but it's, like, this amazing, giant fucking action sequence that is done mostly silently.
Yeah.
It's, like, so incredibly well done. And then also, you mentioned like a bunch of great people that show up in this. The moment where I was just like, wait, what? Fucking Natasha Lyonne just showing up?
This could be the big one.
Right, yes. She just pops up as like somebody who's like the kind of like the receptionist person, but when you like get off of like outside of the, you know, the outdoor of the moon and like inside the base, you're like, all right, come on, get in. And I love the way that like she came onto this was because she lived in the same apartment building, and he was talking to her about like, yeah, I'm in production on space, but she's like, a space movie, you say?
I want to be in that.
Natasha, you know you can't smoke in space. Like, what? It's fine. We're not shooting in space, are we? We're not doing like the Tom Cruise thing, right? Fuck it. But yeah, that movie's great. I definitely would say, if you have not seen Ad Astra, it's an incredibly fascinating movie for sure. I would definitely agree. I would second that recommendation for sure.
Hell yeah.
But my recommendation is a bit more tied to sort of the N for New element of it, but also even perhaps the progeny of the director that we're talking about today. I have the 2020 film Possessor from Brandon Cronenberg, who is the son of David, in case you were not aware. And this is his second film, and I think kind of a modern masterwork of sci-fi and horror.
Yeah.
Where it takes place in an alternate version of 2008, in which we follow this main woman, Voss, played by Andrea Riseborough, who is this assassin who mainly specializes in this technology that allows her to project her consciousness into other bodies. Yeah. At the opening, we see this horrible assassination where this guy gets like stabbed and shot brutally by this woman who puts the gun in her mouth and is just like, pull me out, get me out of this. And then she ends up committing suicide by cop and gets like shot horribly. And then we cut to Andrea Riseborough getting out of like a bed where she has like a weird helmet on. Jennifer Jason Leigh is like, all right, good job. Yeah, we did good. Now you gotta recognize these objects so you can kind of ground yourself. And Voss is depicted as this woman who like has a family. She has like an ex-husband who she maybe is trying to get closer to, but she still is like too distant from not just him, but humanity in general. To kind of attach to him or even her own son. And she's constantly like, even when she's saying like, oh, I'm going to take off time from work to be with you guys, she instantly is just like after a night calling her superior Jennifer Jason Leigh, just being like, hey, can I get like back into this? This is like fucking boring bullshit. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to get back in the field. So she ends up getting back in the field in the form of inhabiting the body of Christopher Abbott, who's this like drug dealer guy who has ended up in a relationship with the daughter of this massive like technology magnate played by Sean Bean.
Yeah.
Yes, and is basically tasked to assassinate him so that they can essentially perform like some form of corporate espionage. They basically have this assassination company kind of have insider trading and take over this company after she murders Sean Bean. And it is an incredibly gory movie.
Yeah.
Like, as much as Crimes of the Future has, like, you know, some, like, oh, body parts and, like, surgery stuff, Brandon is just like, no, gore, all the gore. Especially if you watch, notably, there are 2 different cuts of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the cut version is really that available, because all I've seen is the uncut.
Yeah.
I know when this movie came out originally in its weird 2020 theatrical release, you had to, like, kind of determine which one version was playing based on how brutal this fucking movie is. I believe it's not rated, right? It's not even NC-17, it's just not rated, right?
I believe so.
In an uncut form?
Yeah, I believe so.
Right. Yeah, it's just like, it's one of the most, as someone who, you know, watches a lot of fucked up, gory horror shit all the time, this even has me wincing. Even though this is the 3rd time I've seen this movie, when I rewatched it earlier today, and I'm still just like, oh, ooh, ugh, oof, ugh, this is getting fucking brutal. But I think it manages to balance a lot of that stuff in the sci-fi elements very well. It feels very trippy. It has kind of like a hard sci-fi base to it. In terms of, you get a lot of, like, you know, the aspects of, like I mentioned earlier, the whole thing where Andrea Riseborough, whenever she gets out of that wake, she has to, like, look at this, like, this is a pipe that my grandfather owned. He died before I was born. This is a butterfly that I, you know, captured and put inside the little glass case. Also has to ground her, but at the same time, just has some of the weirdest trippy visuals, especially as, like, the line between her and Christopher Abbott as, like, the movie gets into its second half really blurs. There's, like, the poster shot of this movie, which is Christopher Abbott wearing a weird mutated Andrea Riseborough mask, which is so, like, incredibly upsetting. I think this movie rules, especially, I will say, Brandon has, with his other 2 films, which he did one before this, Antiviral, which is literally about, like, selling celebrity germs.
Yeah.
Which is a lot less interesting than you would assume it would be based on that premise for me.
Yeah, I agree.
And then Infinity Pool, the Alexander Skarsgård, Mia Goth, weird sci-fi movie, which has another cool premise of, like, creating weird duplicates of yourself and watching them get executed to, like, pay for your crimes as a rich person. Interesting idea. Not that fun. Mia Goth notwithstanding, doing some funny fucking weird shit as she tends to do. I have very mixed thoughts on both of those movies. So Possessor still rules to me. It's one of my favorite movies of the 2020s. It is so fucked up and weird. And I'll just say, you know, going to too much spoilery stuff, Sean Bean gets weirdly so massacred in this movie. But through a news report, we find out he didn't die. Which is, like, so funny to me. He gets more brutalized than any other murder I've seen in the movie. And he's like, oh, he's in critical condition, but he's all right. Like, oh, God. He was like, put a bullet in him after that shit. But yeah, I'm guessing based on your kind of commentary, you enjoyed this movie as well, Ben?
I absolutely adore this movie. There are many things in this movie that are kind of my favorite kind of movie. I love corporate espionage in movies, and especially just the idea that this movie takes of, like, you know, corporations want to, like, control our bodies, and this movie is like, yeah, literally, you know? And, you know, I love Christopher Abbott. I think he's one of my favorite actors working today. Anytime he pops up in a movie, I'm fucking there, man. I absolutely adore him. I think he just is such a unique and underrated actor. And everyone should watch James White. That's not my recommendation, but that's like a +1. Everyone should watch James White. It's a great movie. And also Jennifer Jason Leigh, who I also adore. And she is so incredible in this movie. And also has all those weird kind of head devices and stuff like that. But also, yeah, just the look of this movie and just its style and just how, like you said, trippy and kind of psychedelic it is almost. It really appeals to me. And Riseborough's great. I think Sean Bean is really great in this movie. But Abbott just really, really, really kills it. And I agree with you. I really have not been a fan of Brandon Cronenberg's other movies, but this is one of the best movies of the decade so far, and he's got a lot of goodwill with me. So I'm kind of okay with what, whatever he's up to next. But yeah, there's so many things in this movie that I think are, just me stuff, just things I like. And I really love a lot of the gore and a lot of the violence in this movie. It has, like, I mentioned earlier, just kind of, there are certain movies I just describe as, like, very fleshy, right? Like Cronenberg movies and, like, Claire Denis movies. And this movie feels like that. It is just so fleshy and visceral and just gross in a way that I just absolutely adore.
One could describe it as new flesh.
Long live the new flesh. Yeah, I love Possessor so much. I immediately want to watch it right after, like, talking about this, because I really love it, and I'm curious to see what Brandon Cronenberg will do. But this feels like kind of his early magnum opus so far. And I guess while we're on this, kind of a very quick side note, I'm also very curious to see what Caitlin Cronenberg will do. David Cronenberg's other child, his daughter, who has a movie called Humane coming out later this year, which I'm very curious about. The Cronenbergs are turning into the Coppolas, where just all of them are filmmakers and seem to be really interesting. For sure,
yes. So let's just, repeat our titles in case you want to add them to your watch list and whatnot, Brian.
Yes, I had the 2019 film from James Gray, Ad Astra.
And I had the 2020 film from Brandon, son of David Cronenberg, Possessor. And we're going to start wrapping up the show here, but we got to thank some people, Brian. We got to thank Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you get access to bonus podcasts we put out every month, including, audio reviews for new movies. Like, I think, this will be coming out, like, in late July, so we would have already put out the most recent audio review, which would have been about Long Legs.
Yeah.
Which we have not seen yet, and we know precious little about, but I'm sure our minds have already been affected by it, whether for good or ill.
I'm sure there's some long legs in that movie. I don't know.
Some long legs. Yep. Some gams in that picture.
Hopefully no spiders, though. That's my one concern.
I have heard there is surprisingly no spiders, despite the long legs. God. Just other fucked up shit. But also, we put out, like, a big audio podcast every month. Like, we would have, hopefully around the time this is released, our top 10 sci-fi tech from movies and TV would have come out. And we're tentatively planning an audio commentary for August as I maybe prepare for Dragon Con in the near future. Panel announcements coming soon in future episodes for that. But we've tentatively maybe talked about The Iron Giant as a possibility. Some other 1999 movie, talking about the 25th anniversary of 1999. Big year for movies and whatnot, but there's some sort of thing will be out there in August as well, along with, I'm sure an audio review of some, like, there's a new Alien movie coming out soon, Brian. I'm sure we're going to be talking about that, and some other things, but yeah, all on the Patreon, all this bonus stuff for just the $1. It really helps out for the show. In exchange, you get access to more of us talking about bullshit. But for more of us, for free, describing bullshit, you can find us at Cinema2letter on most likely whatever hell site you're perusing. If we're there, we're under Cinema at Cinema2letter. And you can find me specifically on most hell sites, but I'm probably most active on Letterboxd at this point, at Not the Who's Tommy. And occasionally I also do some writing at film-cred.com.
Yeah, you can also find me on Twitter, and sometimes still on there, I say with deep shame. But you can find me on there at BRYANDRADE and the number 3, or you can also follow me on Letterboxd, where I'm much more consistent, and I have to make my lists and log everything like a completely normal person. And follow me on there.
And for more of us, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcast or whatever podcasting platform you are, perusing us on. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you want to listen to all the other great shows that are on the network, and you can dig into our archives on our Podbean feed for the first, 5 seasons of this show and all the old Double Edged Double Bill stuff, 5 years of that particular show, all there for you to listen to. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight. But the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility, have more ears to listen to us, particularly the ears of that guy who has all the ears all over his body from Crimes of the Future. I'm sure he listens on all sorts of different AirPods. How many AirPods does he really need?
Oh, man, yeah.
I guess only the 2 because he's a fake.
Oh, that's true. But if he wanted to look like, he could put AirPods in all of them, how many, sets would he need? 4?
You need quite a few.
4 or 5?
Yes, and hopefully they're blasting cinema to the layer, even if he can't hear it. Those performance artists guys, I'm sure they really want to listen to our show, for sure. And also, maybe put that in the ear of the Life firmware guys so we can get the fucking free chairs.
I want that bone teeth chair. It looks so cool.
Hell yeah. So, we'll just tease now, Brian, we're at the end of the episode. Our next episode, we've reached our E for Egregious pick for Hard Sci-Fi. And we'll be talking about the 2004 adaptation of the Isaac Asimov novel, I, Robot, starring Will Smith. Fascinating movie to talk about, especially because, as we'll mention, we had a rough time picking E for Egregious, but I think this kind of fits the bill based more on reputation. I have seen this movie, but it was on FX in 2005, so I barely remember it. This is one of the ones you haven't seen from this season, right?
Yeah, I'm very curious. I've heard a lot of good things. I know some stuff about the movie, but yeah, I'm very curious, and it'll be great to talk about, of course, Will Smith, talk about Alex Proyas and his weird career and stuff like that.
But that'll be for next time. Until then, everybody. Ryan, after a long podcast recording, I'm pretty famished. I got these plastic bars. You want one?
Oh, yes. I've been meaning to get one of those. Oh, they look so delicious.
Okay, so I got blueberry. I've got strawberry.
Wildberry.
I've got Baja Blast. I can't believe they actually got that flavor. It's really hard to get.